Howdy. All right. Now we got everything working here. Good afternoon. Guess what time it is? It is 4 o'clock in the mountain time, which means 6 o'clock on the East Coast and 3 in the West. It's Tuesday afternoon, and that means only one thing. It is Fertility with Fink and Friends. My name is Dr. Randy Fink, and I am the clinical director of IVF services here at CNY Fertility in Colorado Springs. I am Fink, you are friends, and it is very nice to see everyone joining in. Thanks so much for being here. I saw my good friend Brandis was one of the first to join, so I'll send a wave out there. Journey to Baby W. Hi, how are you? Number one, Bits of Lovely. Ooh, I like that name, Bits of Lovely. How's your week been, everybody? We've got some different feeds here. We've got Instagram, a couple of different Instagram feeds, the CNY feed and mine. We've got LinkedIn and YouTube and Facebook right here in the middle. I'd like to say some hellos, Pretty Binky and Grace Tongue. Nice to see you, Grace. And thank you, Salustio. Thank you for pronouncing it for me because I always have a hard time. Living luxuriously for less, and Kira Smith and Jen, and hello, wonderful human yourself, Mrs. Vince. Nice to see everybody here. Good afternoon to Tamara over there on the Facebook side. Hi to Alexis in Miami, nurse practitioner extraordinaire at the Miami Center of Excellence. And if you happen to be in South Florida, that is a wonderful place for both gynecologic care and fertility cycle monitoring. I hope your week has thus far been good and the weekend was nice. Let's see, what do we got? It's a beautiful 82 degrees here in Colorado Springs today. Thoughts again going out to those who are dealing with wildfires and dealing with floods and bad weather and recovering from fires, and gosh, all those things happening around us. It really makes you want to stop and appreciate the things that you have. If you're familiar with my Instagram, and if you're not, I hope you will please follow me at Randy Fink MD. A few weeks ago, I try to do some fun things, try to keep things fun if we can. But a few weeks, there's a bunch of dad jokes on there, and I keep getting more and more good ones. By the way, I got some new glasses, so we'll see. Get it? Get it there? Yeah. Tried to keep some fun with some of the jokes there. But a few weeks ago, I was driving up my street and passed some beautiful deer. We have lots of deer, lots of wildlife in the neighborhood, and they were just sitting there looking at me. And I said, "Boy, it's the little things in life that make all the difference. And if we can just stop to appreciate them." And sometimes that gets so hard to do, particularly when we get so caught up in all these other busy things in our lives, why we're trying to make money to keep food on the table and get ourselves ahead, and we're trying to get ourselves pregnant. We get so focused on doing those things that sometimes we lose sight of really what's important. And maybe that's family, and maybe that's friends, and that's the love that surrounds us, because very often it's too easy to forget how much love is out there surrounding us, and to feel alone. Have you ever felt alone in your journey? Loneliness doesn't sound like a very exciting topic to talk about, so we won't focus on it for too long. But the thing I want to impress upon you is that, as you go through this journey, the journey towards health, or the journey towards family, fertility, there are a lot of people who are surrounding you, and it's not just your own family and friends, but this community here. I am constantly so impressed with how wonderful and how supportive this community is to itself and to each other. Reach out, make friends to these names that you see on Instagram and on Facebook, because these are folks who will be here with you. These are folks who have been here with you and can really empathize with what you're going through. Hi to Nikki Jones Fit and to Samantha. Nikki, it's great to see you there. Looks like PS Mama 19 did my retrieval this morning. It took a nap and now just binging social media. I can think of no place better to be than with Fink and Friends for a little while. We'll be here for the next hour or so. Get your questions in. So feel free to ask, and we'll do everything we can to try to get to all these questions. This afternoon, I wanted to mention a little story about Arunima Sinha. Arunima Sinha. She was a young woman from India who had this dream of becoming a professional mountaineer. It was always her dream to conquer Mount Everest. And at 23, she decided she was ready to do it. But during her journey, some tragedy struck when she encountered a group of robbers on a train who wanted to steal her belongings. She resisted, and in a cruel twist of fate, they, as a result, pushed her off the moving train. She fell onto the tracks and was struck by another train and lost a leg. Ultimately lost a leg, which is really truly a horrible thing to have to go through, but it didn't stop her. Her dream was to conquer Mount Everest, and what she was able to do was she was able to get fitted with a prosthetic. She was able to endure months and really years of agonizing physical therapy and training, not to mention weather conditions. And just the grueling feat of trying to climb Mount Everest. But in 2013, a mere 2 years after she lost her leg because some people just decided to throw her off a moving train, she summited Mount Everest as the first female amputee to ever do so, and has become an inspiration to women worldwide, to those with disabilities worldwide, and really had the ability to show us that despite the adversity, despite really horrible things that can happen to us, if we keep our mind set to what we're after and we focus on that goal, there's really nothing that we can't achieve. So hats off there. That's today's motivational story. And let's see if we can get to some questions here. Good afternoon to everybody. So happy to have you. Well, let's start out on the CNY Instagram side. Netaboo, hello. Good evening to you, my friend. Let's see. Pretty Binky is over here on this side too. Mrs. Brower. Let's see what we got here. Keybell, what do we got there? Keybell the stylist. I like it. Hi, nice to see you. So naturally classy is here. B Teal says, I did IVF at CNY last September. Had him in June. Congratulations. How long do we have to wait to do another transfer? So once you've had a baby, you may have heard me mention this before. The single preventable risk factor for severe preterm birth is a short interconceptual interval. So by spacing out your children, you increase the probability of having a term birth. So generally, we don't like to see people having babies within a year of each other. If it's less than a year, that really does increase the risk. But I'd say if it's been about 9 months since you had the baby, there, B Teal, I think it's fine to start thinking about proceeding with another transfer, as long as your OB says it's fine and that your body's recovered. We also do not recommend that you be breastfeeding when you do an embryo transfer because it is messing with the hormones, and also breastfeeding while pregnant does increase the risk of miscarriage. Not to mention some of the nutritional issues that can arise as a result of that. So hopefully that is helpful to you. Hi to Lizzie Hunter. Nice to see you. Samantha Simpson says hello from New Mexico, and hello to New Mexico. We are excited to see you as well. Samantha is coming here to Colorado. Looks like roughly how long should we plan to stay to monitor there? Well, so if you're coming to one of our local facilities to monitor, the IVF portion of the cycle, typically is about 2 weeks from the beginning of the cycle. Some people will do their initial baseline at home and then come to stay in Syracuse, Buffalo, Albany, Colorado Springs, soon enough, Sarasota, and do their monitoring locally. I do believe that if you are able to do your monitoring locally with one of our offices, we're able to watch you a bit more carefully. The global team does a wonderful job. They're very busy. There's a little bit more of a personal touch, I think, if you're able to monitor in one of our facilities. So figure the stim lasts from 9 to 12 days. You get your trigger. 35 hours later, you do your retrieval. So figure inside of about 2 weeks is sort of what you should look for. If you're planning to do a fresh transfer, then you would obviously stay a little bit longer. If you're planning to do a frozen transfer, you could leave. We'd like you to stay overnight after you've done your retrieval. Just in case you don't feel well, then we know that our office, we're close by and we can help. But then you can head home if you're planning to stay for that fresh transfer. Then typically, 3 to 5 days, depending on what you're going to do, how long we're going to grow out your embryos. So looking forward to see you here, Samantha. Let's say hi there to Crystal and Tamara on the, forgive me if it's Tamara, capital T, Ms. Suarez, may I call you, had an unsuccessful donor egg frozen embryo transfer on the 5th of August, and on 8/22 stopped the meds. I got a 4-day period on 8/25 and have not gotten another period as I'm to call with cycle day 1. Not sure if my hormones are still messed up. Yeah, perimenopause or least likely pregnancy with my own egg. What are your thoughts? And is this common after an FET? I think you're hitting the nail on the head. So first of all, any gynecologist is going to tell you, well, if you'd like to be pregnant and you missed a period, do a pregnancy test, because that's too easy a thing to bypass and an easy one to either rule in or rule out. Once that has been ruled in or out, the next thing I would think about is, it may be that in that month afterwards, you might not have ovulated. You mentioned perimenopause. What is perimenopause? What does that mean? Perimenopause is any of the hormonal changes that start to happen to women in, let's call it, the 15 years before the onset of menopause. So the average age for menopause in the United States is about 51.4. And it's the 0.4 that makes the difference, 51.4. So, 15 years before and starting at sometime in the 30s, it is not uncommon to start having some perimenopausal type changes. What are these changes? Your periods can change. Your moods may change. Periods may get shorter or longer. You may have more or less PMS. You may not sleep as well. Your libido can start to change. I mentioned sleep. Your sleep starts to change. Some hot flashes at certain times during the cycle. Some vaginal dryness. All manner of things can really be pointed at hormonal issues. Is everything in our life something that's hormonal? No, and people blame a lot of things on hormones that have nothing to do with hormones. But perimenopause is a very real thing. Men actually go through a menopause too, if you weren't aware, and that's called the andropause. The andropause, and it is controversial. Many people will tell you, there's no real such thing, because menopause technically happens when there are no more eggs in the ovaries. And when the eggs in the ovaries are gone, it's the eggs that are producing your estrogen. And so estrogen levels start to drop. And when the estrogen levels are gone, eggs are gone, that technically is menopause, because periods will cease and you will be resplendent with menopausal related side effects. Is that something you should fear? No, definitely not. And why is that? Because we're actually the only species in the animal kingdom that lives beyond its reproductive years. And in fact, in our world, in the world as we know it now, sometimes even, three quarters to half of our lives are going to be spent after menopause. So, is there some analogous situation in men? What is andropause then? Well, it's not quite exactly the same, because it's not that the testicles will dry up and there's nothing else to come from them, because sperm will generally continue to get made in some capacity, one way or the other. We all know stories about people. There have been a number of movie stars close to 80 years old who are fathering offspring. The older we are, there's some increased risk of autism with aging sperm. However, so it's not exactly the same thing, andropause, but hormone levels certainly do drop. This can happen, as early as the 30s, and sometimes even in the 20s in isolated cases, just like some women in the 20s start to have some hormonal problems. But menopause is real, andropause is real, perimenopause is real. So getting back to your question there, Ms. Suarez, capital T, I think it's probably more likely that you just didn't ovulate this month. So if 28 days goes by since your last cycle, or let's call it 30 days for the sake of being even, 30 days happens, you haven't had your period, go ahead and let us know that it's been a month, you haven't had the period yet. We can always check some blood levels, see what's going on, and we can induce a period if we need to. Hi to Crystal, who is excited for a retrieval next week, and we are looking forward to the good news that comes with that. Hello to Castro Racing from Tampa, a lovely place on the globe. And again, if traveling from out of state, how long should we plan to stay in town? So it's a good question. I just want to say that if you are planning to come just for a retrieval, let's say you're planning to come and you're going to be doing a retrieval, and then you're going to freeze your embryos and you're going to head home. We'd like you to get here the day before. So don't try to get where you're going to our facility on the day of your retrieval. It's just too stressful. Travel has become so questioningly reliable that you want to be here the day before. Flights get canceled, flights get delayed, flights get rerouted, diverted to other places, places to, your Airbnb is dirty, or it's not available, or the hotel, overbooked, and, it's one thing or another. Get here the day before. You will be much happier for having done that. And then that morning of your retrieval should be something that's relaxing. As I said, we like you to stay over that night in case you don't feel well, that we're close by, and then head on home. Donnie Soko from Toronto, showing some love to Kilts and team. Thank you, Donnie. Appreciate that. We'll send your regards to the good Dr. Kilts. Let's see what we got here on my Facebook, or my Instagram, rather. Oh, gosh. Here we go. Nikki, what day of my cycle would you guys typically do the FET? We'll be seeing you next month. Woohoo! Thank goodness. About time, sister. So if you're doing a medicated cycle, typically what happens. So again, let's talk about that. Your options for embryo transfers. There is a medicated cycle, FET. FET is a frozen embryo transfer. There's a medicated cycle, and there is a natural cycle. And then there's some variation, within there. What's a medicated cycle? Medicated cycle is the way that we have been doing this for 35 plus years since IVF was invented. You get 6 to 12 days of estrogen, you get 6.5 days of progesterone, and then you get an embryo transfer. We are giving you all the hormones because your body is not making the hormones, because we are giving you the hormones. We are overwhelming the body with the hormones coming from the outside so that we can be in control of every variable and that we can tweak things however we need to. In this fashion, we have, again, complete control over the entire cycle. That estrogen portion is variable. We can use the calendar in order to march it out to when you need to do it. If you know that you have to be here on the on the 20th. Well, we say the progesterone part is fixed at 6.5 days. So we would go back from that. So that means maybe the half day of the 13th, 13.5, that's when you would start your progesterone. But the amount of estrogen you get before that is only to thicken up your lining, and that can be quite variable. So that's a medicated cycle. The other part of the medicated cycle is that you stay on that progesterone until you're about 10 weeks pregnant. So that means a nice shot in the butt every day until 10 weeks of pregnancy. Why 10 weeks of pregnancy? Well, the placenta itself takes over at about 9.5 weeks in terms of making the progesterone. Progestation, pro-pregnancy. It's that progesterone that is responsible for maintaining the pregnancy. Well, it starts to make its own supply by about between 9 and 10 weeks. And so then at 10 weeks, you stop using the shot. A natural cycle is where we let your own body's hormones contribute. Some people think that natural cycle means, so you give me the embryo and you just tell me, call you when I have a birthday party. That's not a natural cycle. We are still monitoring all your hormone levels. We are still monitoring what's going on in your ovaries. In the natural cycle, you have a period, and that's when things start. Just like any other cycle, when you weren't trying to get pregnant, you develop an egg, a follicle in the ovary, which as it grows, secretes estrogen. That's where your estrogen comes from. That estrogen level goes up. And what does it do? It thickens the lining of the uterus, which is designed to be hanging out there waiting for an embryo to implant, just like every other month. When the egg is of a mature size, or the follicle, we can stimulate or trigger the ovulation, which tells the ovary to release the egg. And guess what happens then? You release the egg, you start making your own progesterone. That comes from a portion of the ovary, a cyst in the ovary that's called the corpus luteum. The corpus luteum is where you get your progesterone. And as long as you're making progesterone, guess what you don't need? A shot in the butt. So plus side there, we use some extra progesterone, a little vaginal progesterone, a little vaginal suppository, but you don't have to have the progesterone in oil injection, which is a nice thing. So what's the advantage of that? Well, you're using your own hormones. And as a result, there is said to be a little higher pregnancy rate. There's said to be a little lower miscarriage rate. And there is certainly a lower risk of certain types of pregnancy complications that happen during later on when you're pregnant. So I always favor that natural cycle when it's possible. Now, some people don't have normal periods. And so then we can do what's called a modified natural cycle. And the modified natural is where we give you some letrozole. We give you a little medication to make sure that you're going to ovulate. So if you don't release an egg on your own, we'll make sure that you make an egg in order to make it. So ask about that natural cycle. It really does seem to improve outcomes, and there are fewer injections, fewer medications across the board. So it's always going to be roughly about mid-cycle that you ovulate, and then your time for implantation is usually about a week later. So hopefully that helps, Nikki, with your regular cycles there. Jen Zanger is with us. Hi, Jen. I'm doing a modified natural, after 3 failed medicated FETs. My lining as of Monday was only about 4 millimeters. Thoughts on adding some Follistim and Viagra? So what Jen is telling us is that her lining, the uterine lining, has not thickened up to the point where it's going to be sufficient for allowing an embryo to implant. We look for that uterine lining to be about 7 millimeters. What is the uterine lining? Well, we know that the uterus is made of muscle, right? The job of the muscle is to squeeze the baby out when that time comes. But inside that muscle is a glandular lining that becomes like a baby blanket. That's the place that the embryo is going to implant and grow. That's the part where when you have a period, it's realized that you're not pregnant. And so it says, fine, shut off the hormones, clean everything out, and we'll start again next month. We'll start again fresh. That's why you have a period. So the lining we can measure. Again, we want that to be 7 millimeters. And Jen's telling us that at cycle day 11, her lining was still only 4. I would not want you to do a transfer, Jen, with a 4 millimeter lining. Now, there are some people who just never can get that lining thick enough, and it's a difficult thing. Intrauterine PRP is an advantage. That's probably the most soothing salve we can come up with in order to try to help you to thicken up the uterine lining. You are right that Viagra works to increase blood flow. Viagra obviously increases blood flow to the male genitalia, but it increases blood flow going into the uterine lining as well. So that's a thought. Baby aspirin makes a difference. Follistim is something that we can sometimes add. Follistim is the FSH hormone, which will cause you to develop more follicles. More follicles are lined by some cells. Those cells are called granulosa cells, and that's where your estrogen comes from. So that's going to make more estrogen, and that should thicken up your lining. Jen, I hope that it will be able to happen this cycle, because pretty soon, if you're on a modified natural, what's going to end up happening is that your ovary is going to get to the point where it wants to release the egg. And then that starts the clock ticking on when you're going to have your transfer. So we really want to make sure that that lining is thick enough before or at least by the time the ovary releases the egg, by the time of ovulation. Miss Roselle, 24, says, I had a blighted ovum last transfer. Oh, that really stinks. It does mean I got pregnant, right? Is a laparoscopy still necessary, or should I transfer again? Should I be worried about having another blighted ovum? So as I am fond of saying, having a miscarriage or a non-viable pregnancy of any sort after going through the IVF process is just cruel and unusual. I think there are few things in life that suck as much. And that is certainly one of them. So our thoughts go out to you there, my friend. A blighted ovum happens basically when there is a placenta in an embryo, a placenta, but no fetus, that there's not actually a baby there, but rather just a placenta. So the placenta, or what we call the gestational sac, will take hold and start to grow in the uterus until such a point as the body realizes, well, hold on a minute here. There's no baby in this sac. And when that happens, oftentimes people will start bleeding. Or in the case of IVF, it's very common that we're following this pregnancy from the very first evidence of the pregnancy hormone, and we're doing ultrasounds, and usually we see it happening, and we see, the process progressing, and can make that diagnosis. It is no fault of your own. A miscarriage is not the fault of your own. It is purely a genetic or chromosomal type issue. Even in a tested normal embryo, we can still have a blighted ovum. And how does that happen? Well, the testing is not perfect, but it basically means that it was an embryo issue. So since we know that you can implant a pregnancy and that pregnancy can grow, problem was that it wasn't a healthy pregnancy, I would say, no, I'm not sure that a laparoscopy would be high up on my list. You got pregnant. Your body knows how to do it. As crappy as it is a step towards getting to the right place. You're one half of the way there. So that tells me your brain's talking to your uterus is listening. So even though the pregnancy didn't work out, we still got a little bit closer. And that's a good thing, Miss Roselle. Let's see what we got over here. It looks like Hannah is on the Facebook side and says, if IVF was my only option, would I still need an HSG? My tubes wouldn't need to be cleared for that. And you are absolutely correct. Now, many times, so my preference is I don't order HSGs for people who are planning to do IVF. Why do some doctors like to order the HSG, the dye test? The belief is that the fact is that some people will have some fluid that's in their fallopian tube, and that's called a hydrosalpinx. Hydro means fluid, salpinx is the tube. So if there's fluid that's in the tube, then we know that fluid can be toxic to an embryo. So we really want to know that it's there. However, many sources, including some of the best defined sources in reproductive endocrinology, tell us that the HSG is not the right test to diagnose fluid in the fallopian tube. And for that reason, I do not believe in it. Many of our doctors will order the HSG, even if you're intending to do it. But according to Spiroff, which really wrote the book on reproductive endocrinology, says the HSG is not the right test to do for that. And really any clinically significant hydrosalpinx should likely be visible by ultrasound. We can also diagnose it by MRI. So usually if there's any question about whether there's fluid that's in the fallopian tube, we will order an MRI. So in your case, Hannah, I think you're fine to not do the HSG. I would do the saline sonogram because 100% HSG is not a good enough test to evaluate the uterine cavity. Either a hysteroscopy or a saline sonogram is how we review the uterine cavity. And we want to know, you're investing an awful lot to make some beautiful, perfect little embryos. We want to know that the place those embryos are going to go is just as beautiful and perfect as the embryos themselves. So once a year, the uterine cavity should be evaluated, saline sonogram or hysteroscopy. So thanks for that question, Hannah. London is with us also on the Facebook side. Has the chances of a frozen embryo surviving the thaw process increased? Well, embryos really have about a 97% chance of survival from a thaw. So we have come a long way in being able to understand the process and how to freeze, or what's called to vitrify an embryo and prepare it for freezing, and to get every little water molecule out of the embryo. That's what we have to do, because even one little molecule of water inside can cause that, form an ice crystal that can damage the embryo. 97% is what we expect for embryo survival from a thaw. Now, embryos always thaw better than eggs. So if you're freezing eggs, we expect that we may have about a 75% survival rate from an egg thaw. And that's why it's always better, if we have the opportunity, if we have sperm that we know we'd like to make an embryo with, make the embryo, because the embryo is going to survive the thaw better than an egg itself. What else we got going on here? It's a little past, half past the hour. Fertility with Fink Friends is where we are every Tuesday, and I'm Dr. Randy Fink, and you are friends. I am Fink, you are friends. We're here in Colorado Springs trying to get all your questions answered. Erica Walden says, how often would you recommend getting IVF intralipids? I did one the day before my fresh transfer. Well, we do recommend, so the full protocol for intralipid is that you do it weekly up through the first trimester. So usually through about 12 weeks of pregnancy. What is intralipid? It's a fat infusion. I always think of it as an IV version of the keto diet. It's like IV carnivore. It's a very potent natural anti-inflammatory. The problem is, and if you're at CNY, it's not hard to get an intralipid infusion, because we do them all day, pretty much every day. Problem is when you go home. Finding an infusion center is sometimes a difficult thing to do because every place doesn't have one that's easily accessible. So many people will do their intralipid infusion just around the time of transfer, and that may be the only one that they get. Is that a deal breaker? For most people, it may help. It certainly doesn't hurt, but it is not a deal breaker for most people. I think getting that first dose is really probably the most important, Erica. Siciliana Melissa, hello to you. Can frozen embryos be transferred from one CNY location to the other, and what's the cost of that? Yes, transferring frozen embryos is a very easy process. It takes a little time because the manpower that's involved with it, because they have to stay frozen. There is a special transport device that keeps things frozen that are cryopreserved, keeps them in that same temperature, and then they're usually sent by FedEx. I'm not 100% sure what the cost is. So actually, if you look in your patient portal, if you're a CNY patient, there is a financial welcome packet that has all the prices in it. And I just looked at it the other day. I just can't remember what it said as to what the exact cost is of transferring an embryo. There's a cost, there's an administrative cost, there's a cost for renting the container, and then there's just the shipping cost. It is not pejoratively or punitively expensive. We were reading about it as we were talking about people who are ready to start transferring their embryos to Sarasota. We are getting closer and closer every day to Sarasota going online to be a full service IVF location. There are a limited number of specimens that can be shipped to Sarasota on a daily basis because we cannot overwhelm them. We kind of have to start out slow there, as you can imagine. So if you're thinking about using Sarasota and you'd like to transfer embryos to there, please give it plenty of time for that to take place. When will that facility be open? Again, anytime now. It could be next month. It could be the month after, but we're getting very, very close. Misa K or Miss AK, or I never know how to pronounce yours either. It's so funny because I see these names, every week. It's like family joining. Thanks, again, so much for being here. And people will Instagram message me, and I follow some, and I see their posts, and I see the names, but I just never know how to pronounce some of these things. So please forgive me for mispronouncing. My husband and I will be transferring our 9th of 9 embryos we retrieved in February. What are the statistics for getting through all your embryos and not getting pregnant? Well, it depends on how old the embryos are. Are they day 3 embryos? Are they blastocysts, or are they tested embryos? And how old were you when you make them? So generally speaking, a good rule of thumb is that a tested embryo, one that we've done PGT testing, and we know that it's a normal embryo, we would expect about a 60% probability of a positive pregnancy test. So generally, we say it's going to take 2 euploid embryos for you to be able to get pregnant. If they are blastocysts that are untested, then we say it's going to be about roughly a 30% probability of pregnancy with any one of those embryos. We say it may take 3 to 4 of those embryos to get pregnant. If they are day 3 embryos, it's much harder to predict in that situation because people can be, you might be 45 and you made a day 3 embryo that has a low probability of being normal just based on age alone, or you could be 25 where that same day 3 embryo has a very high chance of being pregnant. But usually we think 8 to 9 day 3 embryos is what it may take to get pregnant. So sounds like you have been through an awful lot, and our thoughts and hopes are with you, my friend, for sure. Jordan is asking, why would my 4AA PGT embryo fail if we're strictly just male factor? Well, because embryos are not perfect. And that's sort of like saying, well, why didn't we get pregnant every single time we had sex? We didn't have, I don't have fertility problems. Why don't we get pregnant? Well, there's a lot of variables that go into that. So again, with that euploid embryo, Jordan, we know that there's a 60% probability of a positive pregnancy test and about a 50% probability of an ongoing pregnancy. So even though we believe that the chromosomes are normal, at least they're normal in the placenta, which is the portion of the embryo that was tested with the PGT, it doesn't tell us anything about all those little metabolic processes that are taking place within the embryo. So all it takes is one of those little things to go wrong, and the embryo won't continue to grow. You had a highly graded embryo, that's a good thing. You had a tested normal embryo, that's also a good thing. Good thing. But as we know, every embryo just isn't perfect. But what that does mean is that hopefully by next time, 2 embryos is what we expect, 2 euploid embryos, and God willing, you'll be pregnant there, my friend. Netaboo says, oh, that's so sweet, says, sending baby dust to you, Misa K5. How very lovely. All right, what else we got going on here? Maciel N22, how long after an egg retrieval should I wait for a frozen transfer? You know, you can do it the very next month. So typically after the retrieval, usually it's about 10 to 12 days for you to get your period. Once that period comes, you can start your FET cycle that very month. There is no evidence that waiting is better, and there is no evidence that sooner is better. So honestly, it simply doesn't make a difference. So whenever you are ready, whenever you've got the gusto to move ahead, we're ready for you. And away goes Paige is here. Nice to see you, my friend. Ditch the diagnosis. I like that one too. Let's see here. Kira Smith says, question I forgot to ask during our visit. I think we spoke a little bit earlier. Thank you for a wonderful and informative visit. My pleasure. Thank you. Question, given my age and last embryos, therefore wanting the best odds possible, what limits should we place on lining and hormone levels to proceed with transfer? So if you are doing a medicated cycle, the estrogen level really isn't what's important. We don't care so much about what the number is. What we care about is, did your lining get thick enough? And so we're looking for a 7 millimeter minimum lining. Although some people, there's caveats with that. There's sometimes that we can proceed without that 7, but 7 is generally what we're looking for. And then once we are at your midway labs, which is typically a week after your embryo transfer, we're looking for that progesterone to be above a 20, and that's in a medicated cycle. In a natural cycle, same thing. I don't care too much about estrogen levels because, again, as long as the lining is thick enough, then the estrogen's done what it's supposed to do, and whatever the number is doesn't so much as matter. A lot of times here at CNY, CNY uses a lot of letrozole, and we'll do what's called a modified natural transfer cycle. And a modified natural cycle is where we give you medication to make sure that your ovary is going to release an egg. It's ovulation induction. My opinion is that if you have normal periods, you're going to release an egg anyway, and there is no reason to mess with the hormones. Because what happens with the letrozole medication is that it will artificially lower your estrogen level. And if we're just following levels, what happens then? Well, somebody looks at your level and says, oh, your level is too low. Now we need to give you estrogen. And we start messing with hormones when we really probably don't have to do that. What's important there is that, again, the progesterone level in that midway, we want to be at or above a 10. So it's 10 for a natural cycle, it's 20 for a medicated cycle. And if it doesn't reach those numbers, then we tend to intervene, try to give you a little bit more. Pretty Binky says, my consultation is this Friday. I have a lot of trips coming up this fall and winter. Is it okay for me to start IVF in January or February? Yes, absolutely. I'm trying to remember the last time any of our locations had to close because of winter weather. I want to say Buffalo might have had to, I think this last year when they got like 8 or 9 feet of snow, something ridiculous like that. But I actually also think that they knew that was coming, and so they were able to divert patients to Syracuse. Yes, absolutely. January, February is a plentiful fine time. because we're really looking at kind of a couple of weeks is what it's going to take for your stimulation. Again, typically 9 to 12 days. We try to get 9 days of stim for egg quality. If it's less than that, sometimes the egg quality is affected, but sometimes we can't help it. So it is what it is there. So I hope that this winter time will see you one step closer to being pregnant there, Ms. Binky. Let's see, how many eggs do you normally retrieve with mini IVF? Well, that's a good question. Mini IVF is really just a dosing mechanism. When we use mini IVF for someone with a normal ovarian reserve, we will get fewer eggs. So therefore, I'm not a fan of that mini IVF for people who have a normal ovarian reserve. Mini IVF was really developed because when we look at folks who have a diminished ovarian reserve, and that means that the AMH level is less than 1.0. That's what we'll call a diminished ovarian reserve. That when we look at those folks, the classic wisdom was always that, well, we are going to pour as much medication on your ovaries as we can in order to get them to respond. The problem when doing that is that we've learned that more is not necessarily better. That you can put more medicine on the ovaries to try to get a response, but what may happen is that the ovaries are like, what? They don't know what to do, and they kind of shut down, and they may not really produce much of anything at all. So the evidence on the mini dose really comes from the European experience. And in Europe, we know that the governments cover most of the IVF. And the governments say, well, they don't care if you get 2 eggs or if you get 20 eggs. They say, we're paying for your meds, so you're going to get a low dose. They're going to get that mini dose. Well, compared to the uber high doses, the mini dose tends to give you the same kind of result as you would get with that very high dose. But at a lower exposure to medication, at a lower cost, lower incidence of side effects, you tend to get the same results with a mini dose. That's really what the mini dose is. So you're looking at mini dose versus very high dose. That's leaving out the idea of an age appropriate dose, which in my opinion is probably a good place to start. So using a mini dose, we expect to get a little lower response than we might with a little bit higher of a dose, but kind of the same response as we would get with a much higher dose. How many eggs would we get? Well, it really depends on how old you are, on the AMH, and what we're dealing with trying to get there. Looks like Maya says, curious to know how long to wait to go back to CNY if not getting pregnant naturally. I had all the blood tests, the HSG and the saline sonogram, and other than a blocked tube, everything is good. By the way, having one blocked tube really doesn't confer a big decrease in your ability to get pregnant. So if you had an HSG and it showed you had one blocked tube, probably not a huge issue in most cases. I did have cervical cancer 2 years ago and had a trachelectomy. Not sure what the next steps would be. So a trachelectomy is where the cervix is removed, but the uterus itself remains. Usually in that situation, they will do what's called an abdominal cerclage. A cerclage, C-E-R-C-L-A-G-E, cerclage, is where the surgeon places a stitch, ties a knot at the bottom part of the uterus so that the pregnancy itself will be able to get held inside, because that's one of the jobs of the cervix, is to be able to hold the pregnancy in. Well, if the cervix was removed due to cervical cancer, you got to put something to hold it there, and that's what that stitch is for. That necessarily means that you would have a C-section for delivery. I would say that if you haven't gotten pregnant at this point, because the cervical mucus is generally a helpful thing. So it may be that there's a problem getting getting the sperm to the inside. So I think it's definitely worth looking into. Now sounds like a good time to me. Let's see. Maya Nook, I believe. Embryo or egg retrieval was yesterday, 16 eggs, 13 fertilized. Estrogen on Friday was 3,500, progesterone 0.95, triggered with Lupron. I'm on cabergoline. The doc said no fresh transfer. Any sense in pushing for it? I would say absolutely not. Why? When that progesterone, when that estrogen level gets above 3,000, the lining of the uterus becomes inhospitable to a pregnancy. Now, undoubtedly, there's going to be somebody watching who's going to say, well, my estradiol was 3,800 and I got pregnant. Could it happen? Yeah, it could happen. Does it happen regularly? No, it does not. And like I say, you've invested an awful lot to make those beautiful embryos. Don't try to put them in a burning building, because that's what you're doing. That lining is just not hospitable to the pregnancy. So I can't emphasize enough. Sounds like a bad idea. Now, the other thing that can happen there is that even if you did get pregnant, you would probably get very, very sick. Which sounds like a winning combo, doesn't it? You're probably not going to get pregnant, but if you do, you're going to be very sick. And why is that? Because above 3,000, there is really what we call ovarian hyperstimulation. And when you're hyperstimulated and then you get pregnant, that number just never goes down. It can cause you to seriously retain a lot of fluid. You can develop a lot of fluid in the abdomen. You can even develop fluid in the brain. And it used to be that people were in a coma every week somewhere from ovarian hyperstimulation. We've learned to treat it a little better now. The cabergoline that you're taking now has a wonderful effect at helping to prevent the severe complications of ovarian hyperstimulation. So no, I think it would not be something that you should push for. You're not doing yourself a favor. And we always hate to tell people no, that you can't do it, because we know how much people, want to do their fresh transfers, especially because it's included in the price. But if it's not going to work, please, don't waste an embryo. It looks like Mayfer 72022. I just like the number. How long do you recommend we be on Omnitrope for a low ovarian reserve? So Omnitrope we use for egg quality. Omnitrope is human growth hormone. And I would say the longer, the better, my friend, to be honest with you. There are some programs that will only use Omnitrope during the stimulation itself. So, I think there's some advantage to being on it. Better to be on it than not to be on it. But if you've got, ideally, I would tell you a minimum of a month or kind of 21 days is some of the evidence I've seen. But even if it can be 2 to 3 months leading up to it, to your retrieval, I think that's probably a really good idea. Helps very much with egg quality. And let's see, Dr. J, I recently had to cancel my cycle because of a slow response with follicles. I want to speak to you for a follow-up or the next steps. Will I pay for another consult fee? Yes. So CNY is, very deeply discounted in a program where you are paying $20,000, $25,000 for IVF. You can probably get the doctor on the phone for a quick consult and you don't get charged for it, even though many programs will still charge you $250 or $350 for, every doctor's visit that you need to have. So they'll say, you can get the message through the nurse, otherwise you have to pay for the visit. CNY is deeply discounted pricing, so that $50 consult fee, when you have to schedule an appointment with a doctor, yes, you do unfortunately end up having to pay for that, or your insurance, if insurance is accepted for what you're doing. K Bell, the stylist, I'll be seeing you again soon. I just like that name, the stylist. Let's see, we got some more questions here. We got maybe a little bit more than 5 minutes here. Pretty ass trucker. I like it. Unless it's pretty as Strucker, that may be it too. I am on the wait list to use donor eggs. I was thinking about speeding up the process and using frozen eggs, but my donor rep says that's not a good idea. Well, so what's the difference between frozen donor eggs and a fresh cycle donor egg? It's a really good question. The answer is that there are probably um, probably tens of thousands of frozen eggs that are hanging out waiting for someone to decide to use them. As we said before, that eggs don't thaw, don't freeze and thaw as well as embryos do. So if you buy a package of, let's say, 6 eggs, well, you may only get 4 eggs out of it, because when they go to thaw those eggs, you might lose a couple of them to the thaw. And you're buying the 6, that's what they do. That, okay, well, you ended up with 4 after thaw. If you wait and you do a fresh cycle for your egg donor and you're buying 6 eggs, you're going to get all 6 eggs, because those eggs just came from her. They went to the lab and now they're yours. They haven't been frozen yet. So you may have a little higher egg count to fertilize if you're using fresh donor eggs as opposed to the frozen donor eggs. That's really the only difference, that eggs don't freeze as well as embryos do, so you're more apt to lose some when it comes time to thaw. Pretty as Strucker. I'm sure that's what it was. Castro Racing, natural modified cycle using gonal F for an embryo transfer cycle after 5 medicated cycles using esterase and PIO. Is this a good protocol to try with PCOS? Well, when you're using a gonadotropin, when you're using gonal F, it just increases the cost. And so, I guess I would really want to take a look and see what's going on there with you. With the natural modified, you were doing medicated cycles with esterase and PIO, but I wonder if ovulation induction would work for you, if Clomid or letrozole would work instead of having to use gonadotropin, just because the costs get so much higher. So I wonder about that, Castro Racing. And LK She, if I'm saying it right. How successful is letrozole and trigger shot with timed intercourse? I normally don't see many stories on timed intercourse. Well, so home intercourse alone, and that is just kind of doing your baby dance, doing your thing, in general, is considered to have about a 1% chance of conceiving per cycle. So that's per menstrual cycle or per month. When we time it properly, we do some ovulation induction, and we give you a trigger shot, and then you time your intercourse at home. That can increase the probability of pregnancy from 2 to 4% is what I would say with home intercourse. And you would say, wow, well, that's not very good. No, it's not. I mean, you don't hear about the people talking about that, because usually they get pregnant and they move on, and it didn't really require all that much out of them. It's just, an extra month, an extra 2 of doing it. No, in the grander scheme of things, it's not a lot more successful than just home intercourse. But if you just look at the numbers, if you go from 1% to 2%, you have doubled your pregnancy rate. So yeah, you could say, wow, you double your pregnancy rate, or maybe even, increase it by 400% by doing that. But still, you're only, in the grander scheme of things, at 2 to 4% per cycle, compared to something like IVF, which can give you up to a 60% probability per embryo. You're looking at an order of magnitude higher success rate with IVF. And so that tends to be where we try to steer people, because we're going to have the highest success rate with it. But yeah, it works, and it's inexpensive, and it's low intervention. So certainly in most general OBGYN practices, this is what they'll do. They'll say, well, let's help you with some timed intercourse. Let's give you some letrozole, which is very inexpensive. We can do the trigger shot. So try that for a few months. And if it doesn't work, then, you can move on to some more aggressive things. Let's see. Jen Bryan. Hi, doctor. Hi, Jen. I have premature ovarian failure, and I still want to try IVF with my own eggs. I have a low AMH and an antral follicle count of 3. I conceived my son naturally 6 years ago. Is it still possible with meds? I've seen it happen. Any other practice would tell you that you have to, they wouldn't do it for you. They tell you you need to use donor eggs. Things to consider, intra-ovarian PRP, which is where we may be able to help to rejuvenate the ovaries, which some would say, oh, that's not really a thing. It's experimental, but it may help. There are some things that we can try to do for you, but the odds are not in your favor in that scenario, but it certainly doesn't mean that you can't try. And we are happy to be here with you to try. Looks like we are going to run out of time for today, unfortunately, folks. We had so many good questions here and a lot more still on the list that I couldn't get to. So my deepest apologies, but I sure hope you'll join me next week, next Tuesday, 4 o'clock Mountain Time, 6 o'clock on the East Coast, 3 o'clock on the West, for Fertility with Fink and Friends. Being here with you is really the highlight of my week. I love the interaction we're able to have. I certainly hope that I am able to bring, some light and joy. Please follow my Instagram if you want to see some cute jokes, and we try to do some fun things. We try to do some educational things as well, but you know what's funny? It's the funny things that get all the hits. Brandis and I did a thing on Friday on CNYs. I think it's at 39,000 views now. Anything educational, we get a couple hundred views. So I guess people like to laugh, and we're happy to do that. Remember, fertility is part of your journey. It is not your novel. It ain't your book. It is only a chapter, and it's a chapter that we are here to help you rewrite. So until next time, God bless everybody. Thanks so much for being here, and good night.